Hello, this is a video that I've been wanting to make for a really long time, and it's of this fan art piece that I did a few years ago of the show Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is my favorite animated series, and I've watched it a million times over and over again. So a few years ago I decided that it's finally time to do a nice fan art piece. And so I fortunately have most of the process recorded, and I figured I will share it with you guys because it's better late than never. So what you're looking at now is some thumbnails and preliminary sketches of the characters that I did. And I decided to go for a more casual type of scene, so I pretty much picked one of my favorite moments, or I guess parts in the show where the gang finally gets together, Zuko included. So I decided to make an illustration of that, and as you can see here, I'm following my typical somewhat back and forth convoluted process between digital and traditional media. So as I showed you just now, I did the thumbnail in like the initial sketch by hand, and then I basically just snapped a photo of it and brought it into Photoshop and did the finalized sketch there, which is what you're looking at now. Unfortunately, I don't have like very good footage of that, but I think this is more than enough to show the basic gist of my process. And after I finished pretty much finalizing all the elements and cleaning up all the characters, like more or less, I just printed it out and went ahead to the final cleanup traditionally, using a light box, which you're about to see in a second. So when I was looking at some of the old footage that I have from back then, I found a bunch of commission pieces that I did where I went straight into inking after printing out the digital sketch. So I just used the light box for the sketch and inked right on top of that. And it made me kind of think about why for some of the pieces I didn't do that and did a secondary pencil sketch over top. And I'm thinking it's probably because it was too straining to look at the light box for a long time. So for some of the pieces, like the bigger ones and the ones that require a lot more detail, I decided to just do a secondary cleanup with a color erase pencil and then go from there. And probably because I wasn't like 100% sure which direction I was going to take the rendering, so the easiest way to determine that later is to just have the clean sketch in some pretty light colored pencils on the final sheet of paper, which I believe in this case was a 9x12 mixed media Strathmore paper pad. I really like that paper a lot, and I still use it sometimes. So it's a lot smoother. It's kind of similar to hot press watercolor paper, so it's very smooth and finished, and it's not so thick that you can't see the printed out digital sketch underneath, which is why I really like this paper, because I do use the light box pretty frequently. But yeah, as you can see here, we're moving on to the next step, which is the inking. So at this point, I suppose I decided that I'm just gonna go straight ahead and ink the whole illustration. And like I've mentioned in my previous videos, I use a G-nib by Deleter. It's my favorite nib to ink with. Super smooth, pretty decent line variation, and actually lasts forever. Honestly, I feel like I have used some of these nibs for years before I felt like it's finally time to just switch it out to a fresh one. So I would highly recommend those for inking if it's something that you're interested in. But yeah, so this step is pretty tedious. It takes a while, but I really kind of relish in being able to add all the little shadows in and just clean the whole thing up, although it is really clean already, as you can see. But one of the reasons why I like using colored pencils for the final cleanup, I guess, is because it actually melts away pretty completely once the piece is done, as you will see as the video progresses. I like that a lot, and the red sometimes does add a little bit of an extra interest underneath the ink and watercolors that are going to be covering most of the characters up in the end. So yeah, so as you can see, Even though it might seem redundant to ink straight over the super clean lines, I just want to point out that one of the reasons why this is different than just having a pencil sketch underneath is because I do go in with the darker parts already in this step, and as you will see a little bit later, I'm going to go back in when I'm done with the basic lines and put even more dark places, fill the areas with black ink. It's not actually totally black. I typically mix my black ink with some sort of brown. That's something I like to do a lot. I think I do it for most of my pieces, and I do dilute it with water somewhat so it's not super dark, although I will say that in this particular piece it is pretty dark. Typically I will mix in more water than this, but yeah. I'm just gonna insert some background music here so you can just watch me ink the rest of this, and then I will come back with the voiceover once I move on to the next step. So here I'm doing the last part of the line work, and I'm switching to a brush because I figured that since Appa is so big compared to all the other characters, I thought that using a brush might be a good change of pace so that the whole thing just doesn't look too much the same when it comes to line work. Plus, because there's so many just long lines and a lot of fur, I thought that using a brush would be a better approach to create like a soft type of effect. And as you can see, I also diluted the ink a little bit more specifically for that reason, to soften the look of the fur. So I went over and just slowly inked the whole thing with a brush. I know that using a brush might be intimidating to some people for inking, as it definitely was for me before I actually tried it, but it is a lot easier than it seems, I found, as long as the brush that you're using is kind of more supple and like sturdy, so it has less bend. So I find that specifically for inking, I prefer to use nylon brushes, like not real sable hair brushes, because those are a lot softer, even though they do hold more ink and they tend to be better for different purposes. But for inking specifically, where some precision is involved, I really like to use just these standard relatively inexpensive brushes that you can find at any art store. Like this one I got from a local art store called Above Ground. It's just their brand of brush and it's pretty cheap, so I use it a lot for many years. I would totally recommend. Anyway, so as you can see here too, I'm starting to put in a lot of the darks, so I'm just filling in some areas, but I really like to vary up the tones within darker areas. So as you can see, like for the paws, for instance, I don't just fill the whole thing in black as you may think I would, but instead I vary it up a little bit, so it adds some interest visually, and I think it's better to not have huge areas that are too dark because they draw too much attention. So I kind of did that with the nose, but even the nose, if you zoom in, like I wish I kind of zoomed in on this one, but there is a lot of tonal variation within it. So now that I've finished inking all the basic line work, the next step for me is to put in the darks using a brush as well. And as you can see, something that's a little bit difficult to capture because of the angle of the recording, what I do is I fill in the area with black, like to create the highlights in the hair. I will fill the whole area in with black, and then before it has a chance to dry, I take a paper towel and I just dab some of it out to create the highlights. It's a really quick way of doing it and a really nice texture, so something I would recommend experimenting with. And so once I finish the hair, which pretty much is the darkest, I think, or are some of the darkest areas in the drawing, I mix a more diluted grayish brown color and fill out the rest of the darks. So what I'm doing here is not putting down shadows, but just filling in some areas. I don't really know what to call the step exactly, because the next step after this will be putting in some shadows. I swear, recording the voiceover in this video is cursed. All this random stuff keeps happening in the background, so I have to keep stopping the recording and waiting for it to finish, like the fire alarm just went off. Anyways, yeah, so actually this gave me a chance to clarify my thoughts on the process of this piece. So I wanted to mention that one of the biggest things about my process when it comes to fully colored illustrations is that I like to leave as little work for the actual coloring as possible, and that's precisely why I do so much tonal distribution with ink without having to worry about the color, like the local colors. That's the last step that I do, which obviously you will see, but yeah, that's essentially what I'm doing. So I will put down all the tones first with ink, and that gives me a very coherent idea of what the tonal distribution will be like in all the piece, and that allows me to like control the composition better without wasting a bunch of time trying to mix the exact color and tone at the same time, if that makes any sense to you guys. So after I put down the tones with ink, I also add some shadows in as well. I do pick a relatively light tone for the shadows. It's the same ink that I use for the line work, except I put a bunch of water in it, so it's just a diluted version, obviously. But yeah, some of that sometimes gets covered by the color that I put on top of it, but it's fine because you can still kind of see it underneath. And then my last step is typically a rendering / polishing step in which I used a few colored pencils. So that is the reason why I don't go in harder on the shadows, because it is something I do revisit near the end. But yeah, so as you can see, I actually included a little bit of the mixing of colors that I do. I kind of mix the colors one at a time, and it's pretty easy to just test them on the sheet of paper to see if they will go well with the rest of the colors that have been mixed previously. And as you can see here, I started with the skin tone for all the characters one by one, and then moved on to the next color, which is in this case red or orange. So I kind of go one by one and just fill out all the areas necessary. I guess that's a pretty average way of going about it. I guess there's not much to say about that, but I am a little bit meticulous about mixing the colors just to make sure that they look good together. Like for instance, it took me a little while, I remember, to mix this specific like dusty looking blue, and of course, like working with existing material, like that is the color that is already used in the animation, but of course it's not the exact same because I do have to make sure to tweak it slightly so that it matches up with the rest of the color scheme, which is kind of earthy with some bright pops of color but not too many. And I do actually really like the way the arrow sits in the middle of the piece and it really kind of pops out. I think it's a nice touch compositionally that I didn't necessarily account for while I was doing the sketch, but it's just like one of those happy accidents. Another thing I wanted to mention that I didn't mention while I was showing you guys the sketching footage is that I do typically think about the composition pretty thoroughly in the sketching process, obviously. And one of the biggest changes that I made from the thumbnail is moving over Momo to the side to break up the space, like the dead space that's right on the right of all the characters. So yeah, and as you can see now, I am done with all the characters and I'm moving on to the water, which took some time, and I was kind of going in blind, not knowing exactly how I'm going to tackle it, but I knew for sure that I'm not going to ink over the pencil sketch, which I think was a really good decision. I pretty much decided that right off the bat because I do think it's really nice when the rendering or finishing approach of the effects as opposed to the characters is different, so it does kind of stand out, which is good. I think if I did ink the water using like a dark blue ink or something, it would really flatten it out, so it's nice to kind of create rendering variation throughout the piece. I think it adds a lot to it. And so without really doing much planning, I just ended up picking a bunch of different blue colors, and then I figured that it would be nice to introduce a little bit of green in there, so I did that, and it was relatively experimentational, but since I went to college for animation, I do remember really liking effects animation. I didn't really get into it much. I didn't do a whole lot of it myself, but I have some books on that, and so I really like to reference effects animation specifically when it comes to doing when it comes to rendering or like figuring out how to render or approach drawing different elements like water or fire. I think animation really has it down when it comes to movement or like the illusion of movement, and studying effects animation is something I would totally recommend if you draw a lot of elemental type of stuff. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah, I just thought I'd mention that because it is something that I do every time I have to draw something like this. So as you can see now, I'm going with a little bit more details in the water using a brush still. And I think it was a pretty nice touch to use perspective lines to kind of reinforce the angle of the whole shot within the water, or I guess the idea is that it's raining and she's kind of like protecting the crew from the rain. But anyways, I wanted to mention that I think it's always a good idea to kind of take advantage of certain visual aspects of the illustration and take what you can get to reinforce perspective, because it kind of really creates depth in a very simple way. So it's a good example of that, I think, using the rain to really show like the angle from above. Now I'm just putting a little bit of details into the clouds, and I decided to go very sparingly when it came to that because there's so much going on in the middle of the piece and above the characters that I figured it really doesn't need much to the sides to divert attention away from the center of the piece where all the information is concentrated. But I did put in a little bit of tone here and there to help move the viewer's eye around the piece. I like to put in a lot of directional strokes I guess is a way to put it, in order to reinforce where the eye should be going. So even if it starts to wander around the piece, there will be a bunch of kind of curvy directional lines that will take it back into the center or the focal point. So now what you're looking at is pretty much the last step of the piece, on paper anyways, that is the rendering with a pencil. So typically what I like to do is pick a very small amount of colors and go into the shadow areas of the piece to just strengthen and reinforce the darker areas. That's typically the only thing that I do in this step, and it is a little bit of extra work, but I think it really ties the piece together, especially when using very few colors. Since I did this piece a while back when I didn't really have a whole lot of color pencils to choose from, I actually just used color erase pencils, which are the same ones that I used to outline the sketch in the beginning. These pencils are not necessarily for coloring, but I think they work really well because they're very hard, and so it's very easy to create a super smooth gradient with them, and that's one of the reasons why I like using them so much. Even though since then I have purchased a huge set of polychromos pencils, and I like those a lot as well. There is definitely a difference between these two, and sometimes I will still go back and use the color erase pencils to do this step of the artwork. And yeah, so the last thing that you're looking at here is me adding a little bit of blue all over the piece, and that is to create more of an atmospheric look. Maybe I guess this could be like ambient lighting or something like that. I don't know what the technical term is, but as you can see, it actually does a lot, even though it takes so little time to add in these blue gradients all over the place. So yeah, as you can see, that's my palette, and the piece is done. This is pretty much the entirety of the process. Since I was so happy with this one, I actually didn't even do a whole lot of editing in Photoshop after I scanned it at all. And so what you saw at the very beginning was actually a poster version of this piece, which is quite a bit larger than the piece itself, but I think it still holds up super well. Speaking of which, I will be putting up a limited run of the larger posters up in my shop, hopefully by the time this video is live, so you can check out my shop if you're interested in a bigger poster of this particular piece. But yeah, I'm so glad I was finally able to share the process of this piece with you guys. It's one of my favorite ones that I've done. I don't have the original anymore, unfortunately, because I sold it, but hopefully it's happy with its owner, and just glad that I finally edited this video and excited to do the next one. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I will see you soon. Bye.